Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. Last week, we had the opportunity to talk to Morgan Bennett about traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, and anxiety. That was an amazing episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen, make sure you go back to hear her personal experiences and how she copes through those symptoms every day. This week, Kelsi is engaging in some self-care. She is living it up in Florida, getting some sunshine, good vitamin D. So I will be meeting with a good friend, Kimberly Anderson. We are going to be talking all about religious trauma and how that impacts our identity development. So really excited for this episode. Always love having a fellow therapist on. Welcome, Kimberly. It is so exciting to have you here today. Can you tell, I didn't give you an intro at all, so can you kind of let your audience or let our audience know who you are, where you're from, your background, anything you're willing to share, and kind of why this is an important topic for you to talk about today?
Love to. Thank you, Amanda. My name is Kimberly Anderson. I am an associate marriage and family therapist in California. And I'm also a marriage and family therapist intern in the state of Utah. I went to University of San Francisco to get my second master's degree in counseling psychology. My first master's degree is in Master of Fine Arts degree in photography. I got that from Utah State University, and I've been a commercial photographer for 30 years. I was a university professor for about 10 years. And then I made a hard pivot, although it's interesting, it's not so much of a hard pivot, and if I think about it, moving from being a professor to being a therapist. I am a transgender woman. I was assigned male at birth, and at about 45 years of age, I said, you know what, I have to make a big change in my life, and I have to live authentically. And so my marriage of 20 years ended, and in that time, we had two lovely children, and they're now in their adult mid-20s, and well on their ways to having an amazing lives. And I've rebuilt my life kind of from scratch. I was raised in a very orthodox religious home. The faith tradition that my parents had was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They are also known as the Mormons. And from here on out in the podcast, I'll be referring to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the Mormons. That's kind of the colloquial name. It is interesting that in the past few years, the church has gone from embracing and having multi-million-dollar ad campaigns and even feature-length films made about Meet the Mormons. And now that's gone back to, we're not Mormons, we're now members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in an effort to move away from that stigma of being called Mormon. And we could talk a lot about a lot of things. So I'm a trauma-informed therapist. I do not practice any modalities other than just like narrative therapy and talk therapy. The narrative therapy component for me comes in heavily in my documentary photography practice, and having taught documentary photography in the college setting for years, and learning that it kind of plays really well into this idea of narrative therapy working through trauma. Happened to be, I've resigned from the Mormon Church. 2016, I resigned from the Mormon Church officially, and we can get into that as a point of abuse. Just the act of resigning from the Mormon Church is basically an act of trauma. It's interesting. Today, I'm coming to you from the Sunstone headquarters here in Salt Lake City. Sunstone is a progressive think tank of Mormon thought. I consider the Sunstone crowd the Jesuits of Mormonism, if that's a thing that we can say.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the outside-the-box thinkers, and we welcome all shades of Mormonism. There are hundreds of sects of Mormonism, and then there's also, we consider ex-Mormonism to be a shade of Mormonism because we were informed by our faith community and our religious tradition. Our moral values largely come from a Judeo-Christian background, influenced through the lens of Mormonism. And so with Sunstone, we talk about there are more than one way to Mormon. There is also more than one way to ex-Mormon.
Yeah,
so that's kind of my whole thing.
Yeah, and there's I'm sure, you have our identities are so multidimensional. You go on forever sharing about who you are. The thing that kind of came to mind for me as you were sharing is that your identity development we've had this with a few other podcast guests. You kind of identify saying, I had a major life transition or career transition. In addition to, your transgender transition. Oh, that was a weird word combination. But oftentimes we look back and we realize how necessary that path was to get us where we are. And, therapy, mental health work is art, right? And so you're helping people get through their life experiences. And so we can kind of see those stepping stones that got you to the where you are today. Like you kind of talked about the narrative therapy. So I
Right.
love that connection. So some of the basics for people that aren't aware, because I think a lot of times when we talk about trauma, oftentimes general society thinks war veterans,
Right.
rape survivors, right? Religious trauma is something that many have never even probably even realized as a concept. So how would you define religious trauma?
Well, religious trauma actually now has a clinical kind of an acronym called RTS, Religious Trauma Syndrome. And if you want, we can Google it quickly and look at those criteria. I don't have them pulled up, so we could do that. But in a nutshell, religious trauma involves stages of identity development. And I kind of go back to James Marcia, psychologist, and he has 4 stages of identity. And often, as you are developing an identity within a religious structure, you are forced to adopt whatever identity the religious organization wants you to be. In other words, you have to do this. And we're talking specifically gender roles, gender performative roles, as far as like being a father and a husband and a breadwinner and a patriarch. Very feminine gendered roles would be mother, caregiver, wife, a housekeeper, supporter to the husband. So very gendered roles often within Orthodox religious structures. And often those that the life path that they expect you to adopt is given to you, is kind of foisted on you at a very, very early age. And often in religious structures, there are rites of passage that happen at certain points in your life. And those religious or rites of passage are often very gendered. So you may be expected to do these things along the way, and you may not feel like you want to do these things, whether or not you're trans, whether or not you're queer, whether or not you're female, whether or not you're a male identifying person. Regardless of who you are, you may not want to do those things in that role. And within an Orthodox religious system, you don't have a choice to deviate. So now we get into this idea that I'm a child. Let's talk about developmental identity. I'm a child. I'm relying on you, my parent, to give me shelter, to give me warmth, to give me food, to give me drink, to give me love, to keep me clothed, but most of all, to give me love. That's really all a child wants from their parent. And when a child wants love and caring from their parent, we will sacrifice our identity at all costs to receive that love from our parents. That's what we do. If our parents give us a love based on conditions, if our love from our parents comes is predicated or based on performance, then it's not an unconditional love. It's more of a transactional love from the parent to the child. So the child sees that, oh, love from you is dependent on me performing. So we start to look at love as currency. I'm going to get love from you, but I have to give you something in return. And the only thing a child can give to a parent is obedience. So we're taught to obey at all costs in everything from a very young age. And often that results in what James Marcia calls identity foreclosure. In other words, your identity, your chance to form an identity, it is foreclosed upon and it is replaced by a demand from someone else that you conform to what they would like and what they would expect you to do.
Ugh, it's still stuck in my gut. It's in my chest and it's in my gut when you compared love and money, basically, right? Like this is now a transaction. This is no longer relational. Um, it's so separating and dividing.
Yeah.
And a family, like you said, it's love, it's connection, it's understanding, it's unconditional
In best case
exchange.
scenarios, it is, but that's not often
Yeah.
the case. We learn from many different family systems that love is often the third or the fourth or the fifth consideration. Some
Yeah.
families are just barely getting by, depending on social economic status, trauma status, race, area of the world they live in. The love from a family can often be the back burner because they're just busy. They're preoccupied with just the basics of staying alive and functioning.
Absolutely. Where do you see, so oftentimes with my trauma clients I work with, it's really validating that you don't know what you don't know until you see something different.
Right.
So a lot of times just the questioning and the second guessing or wait a minute, that wasn't trauma though, or it wasn't that bad, or that couldn't have been, my parents weren't
Oh,
that bad until they
these are all
see.
lines I've heard from my clients.
Right? Until you go to somebody else, like you get to go to a friend's house and
Yeah.
their parents don't talk to them that way, or they don't have to do things that you have to do, or they have all the resources, they have all the food in the cabinets, right? Then that's where you start to second guess, like, maybe this isn't everybody's reality. So for you personally, or people you've worked with, or other people related to the religious identity development, the religious trauma, where did those things start to show, or where do you see those moments hit?
Of comparing your experience to your neighbor's experience.
Or realizing, because you left the church, obviously you left
Right.
for a reason. So, like, what moments started to hit for you and like make you kind of say, huh, maybe this isn't what aligns with me and where I want to be in the world. Maybe this isn't safe. Maybe this isn't healthy.
What you're talking about in religious terms, we call shelf breaking items. These things that come along in your life that really don't line up with what your religious structure would have you think or believe or feel. But yet, in the core of who you are, you're thinking now, but wait a minute, this is my core value. This is who I am. And you're telling me that this is actually the way that it is, whether it's an inner dialogue based on what you're being told from the outside, or what you believe in the core of who you are as far as honesty, integrity, trustworthiness, truth. And then you're learning from outside sources to question your own moral compass. These are, when they're in the religious context, we often call them shelf items. We're taught to just ignore this thing. We're going to put it on a shelf and we'll deal with it later.
Oh,
For this metaphorical shelf, we're going to put all this stuff that we just can't make sense of. So there's a phrase called cognitive dissonance, where we have these irreconcilable things in our brain. We don't know what to do with these things. And often we can either choose to do one of two things. Well, three things really. We can ignore them, we can obsess over them, or we can put them on our shelf to deal with later. If we put enough of those on our shelf ultimately crumbles. And then we have an existential crisis of really magnanimous proportions. I mean, it is deep. And in
yeah.
Mormonism and other high demand religious systems, and there's a lot of overlap, and we see this on TikTok, we see this on Facebook, we see this on Instagram, all across social media, these high demand religious structures, people that have left, we're all finding each other. And we're learning that all of our system demands on us ultimately broke us. So for me, my shelf breaking item really kind of boils down to one thing. In Mormonism, we are taught that we have a direct conduit, a direct path of revelation from God through certain men to us. And one of the rites of passage of a young Mormon child is around the age of 15, 16, 17, 18 years old to get a blessing from a particular older man in your area called a patriarch. And this man, the patriarch, is so spiritually attuned, is so in touch with God that he is the only person that is qualified and ordained and set apart to receive God's message to you in the form of a blessing that charts out the course of your life. So you go to this patriarch, you go to his home, he lays his hands on your head, and he prays to God, and then this blessing from God through him is now the course of your life. This blessing is recorded, and then it's typed out, and you get a printout of it, and you keep this with you throughout your life to refer back to say, oh yeah, here's what's next. Here's what's next. All of these blessings are conditional upon, that's right, performance and obedience.
So if I'm understanding, this is
It's a little
now
messy.
your
Yeah.
almost like a job description, but for your life now. You have
Yeah.
to now meet all these different objectives and activities. And if you start to sway or wonder what you're supposed to be doing, go back to the job description.
Right. And if you're not hitting all these benchmarks, it means that you're not righteous enough, you're not faithful enough, you're not going to church enough, you're not reading your scriptures enough, you're not praying enough. So this blessing is literally a blueprint for how your life is going to be if you are worthy and obedient. And at the end of every blessing, it says you will die and you'll be resurrected and you'll meet God and et cetera, et cetera. So here I am at probably age 16, 17, meeting my patriarch for the first time, really, and sitting down under his hands. And I'm thinking, all right, here we go, God. Let's do this. You're going to tell the world, you're going to spill the beans about Kimberly's transgender identity to the patriarch, to the world, to your parents, and the jig is up. This is your chance for God to really justify all the things that you've been feeling in your body your entire life. I knew when I was about age 4 to 5.
I was going to ask because you mentioned you transitioned at 45, but
Right.
you've known.
Oh, my entire life.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's not unusual for the transgender person, but it's not always true. There are
Yeah.
kind of major developmental stages where trans people have the self-awareness. For me, it was very, very early. So
So
I
you
said,
were hoping that this blessing was going to reveal your true identity, that you felt who
yeah.
you were.
And
Okay.
God was going to phrase it in a way that would be acceptable to the patriarch, acceptable to my parents, acceptable to the church, and most of all, acceptable to me. So I was excited and terrified at the same time. There's this dialectic that I live in my entire life. By the way, I'm also a Libra, if that matters to anybody.
The scales. The scales.
This and that all my life. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Libra. So this patriarchal blessing lasts about 5-10 minutes. And at the end of it, I'm thinking, are we done? Are we
Now,
done?
is this, I'm sorry to cut you off. Is this something to do that you do just one-on-one? Or is family there? Is your community there? Is the church there?
That's a great question. Thank you for making me explain that a little bit more. Usually it's you and the patriarch and your parents.
Okay.
Sometimes your siblings will be there, but usually not. It's usually just your parents.
Okay.
And they are asked, your parents are asked not to make any notes because the official record is recorded by the patriarch's wife on a tape recorder. And then she'll transcribe that. They send it to Salt Lake, and then it comes back on this official document.
So can I ask what what blessing you were given? What world you were supposed to now live? What your blueprint was?
Well, my blueprint was I was going to go on a mission and be a great teacher and come back and find a wife and have wonderful kids and be faithful in the church and die and be resurrected in the first morning and come up and meet Jesus. That's basically the gist of the prayer or the blessing.
So are any more? I have so many questions. I know you want to answer I want to hear all about
No, no,
yours,
no.
but
We
now
could
I'm
do.
like,
I mean, do we
is
have
that
3 or 4 hours
everybody's?
planned for today?
Is that everybody's? I mean, that sounds so very generic. Does anyone get anything more specific than that?
So this is what's really interesting. We are told not to share our patriarchal blessings with anybody else other than our immediate families and our spouses. So
Lord.
now there's actually a whole organization devoted to, you can submit your blessing to this website, and you can also compare and contrast other blessings with what you got. Hey, guess what? They're all the same.
I had a feeling. I had a
They're
feeling.
all kind of the same. I mean, there are variations on a theme. It's kind of all the same.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So you get your
Okay.
blessing,
So
and you're
God's kind of
like,
a
they
scratch
said
record,
nothing about
literally.
my identity, who I feel.
Right. And the blessing ends, and I'm thinking to myself, now, did he say anything at all about gender, about being an other gender? And I'm really kind of rewinding and thinking, did I miss it? Did I miss it? Did I miss it? And I didn't hear any of that. And in that moment, knowing that it wasn't even addressed in an obtuse fashion, I found out two things about God. Well, one of two things. Either God isn't real, or if God is real, and here is his chance to tell me the course of my life, and God says nothing about the most critical core aspect of who I am, then God is a dick. You're going to hang me on the line my entire life. I've done everything I can to make sure I'm ready for this moment, and you're either ignoring me because you're not there, which has its own huge set of ramifications, or you heard me, you see me, and you have nothing to say about this. So fuck you, God.
Is there a third? My brain's just going, is there some people that might take that and then internalize? Well, I'm sure there is shame already, but internalize or like start second guessing their own reality. Like, okay, wait,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, you didn't mention anything about this. Am I losing my mind? Am I,
Oh, cue the internal gaslighting in 3, 2, 1,
yeah,
boop, right? And then all of a sudden, every decision you're thinking, am I really feeling this way? Is this
yeah.
the devil? Is this the adversary? Am I being
Mm.
influenced by Satan? Are these real, authentic feelings, or are these planted memories from society? What's going on? So then you have this internal crushing doubt. And you're also told, by the way, what you're feeling is abhorrent. It's a sin. It will take you to hell. So you just learn to squash it down. And that is the identity foreclosure in James Marcia's 4-square model of identity development.
So how might that look for somebody? Because we obviously know how many people have left the community. Your story is one, and being trans is a very obvious discrepancy between that faith and not getting the message from God that
Right,
they identified your gender. How
right.
might people that aren't trans or don't have as much of a dissonance maybe with their identity, like how does that kind of play out in that same form? Does that question make sense? Like how other
Well,
people shelves have broke, I guess.
so my shelf breaking on the moment of my patriarchal blessing, when I share that with other people that have left Mormonism, it's kind of a unique point for your shelf to break.
Yeah.
And it's a unique situation to have a shelf breaking moment. Here's my identity. God's ignoring it. Oh, I know Mormonism isn't true. I know God isn't real.
Yeah.
And I'm a teenager and my shelf is broken and I'm stuck in this system. Other people's shelves will break when they learn truth about historical information, about the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. They learn the truth about the creation of certain records that we consider scripture, namely the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham, that these translation stories that we've been told our whole lives, when we learn that none of those things are true. In fact, all the things that we were taught as children that were lies about the church, we learn as adults now with more research and brilliant researchers, we learn that those things actually were true. Here's where it gets really fun. The research is so thick, it's so documented with so many primary sources that now the church is being confronted and actually integrating some of those messages that I was taught were bold-faced lies. Now the church has them published as truth about the early church history with a unique twist, with a unique flavor, with a unique lens of either inclusion or exclusion to, of course, make the church look good. And then the church will say, well, we've always been teaching this. Here it is on the website. And we're like, hey, wait a minute. The internet did not exist before 1999. I was a member of the church for 35, 40 years. And we dug and we asked, and we were told specifically not to believe these things. These things are lies. Now you're telling me that's the truth? What's going on here?
Global systemic level gaslighting now.
Oh, it's so the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, i.e., the Mormons, they have taken George Orwell's 1984 and really modeled all of church PR, any external facing information about the church. We have a thing called what's called the rabbit hole of memory, the memory hole, where things that we were taught or things that were said that they later recanted or thrown down the memory hole,
Mm.
very Orwellian fashion. And but people, once it's on the internet, no matter how good you are at deleting information, people can go and extract information, and it has come back and it has haunted the church in really damaging ways.
So did you say 18 when you had the
Yes, I
blessing?
can't remember the exact day, but I was 16,
Yeah,
17,
older
18 years
teen.
old. Yeah.
So you had this realization and you said, F God, or God isn't real. And then what happened in that time span between 18 and 45 when you transitioned at 45, 18 in 2016 when you finally left the church?
Well, what happened was I realized that I was powerless to do anything about my identity. There was no language, there was no context, there was no role modeling. There was the complete opposite of acceptance about trans people and gay people and queer people. And I was taught literally to lie in order to hide myself, in order to remain safe. This is the early 80s, mid 80s. So we're talking the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We're talking about Ryan White coming out. Oh, blood transfusions. Okay, he's the rare exception. I remember being taught in church that don't go to San Francisco. You'll be sucked in with the gays. You'll get AIDS, and you'll die alone, and you'll go to hell. I specifically remember that. And it's actually one of the reasons I chose to go to San Francisco to get my graduate degree in counseling psychology. I wanted to reclaim San Francisco as mine because I had very definite ideas of getting out of Utah, getting on a train or a bus or whatever, getting to San Francisco and sorting out my life. I have very, very vivid memories of doing that and having those memories crushed because I would be sucked in by the gays, I would get HIV/AIDS, and I would die alone. Now, to be fair, that may have happened. That may have been true. There are hundreds of my contemporaries that were in the Bay or that moved there that did catch HIV and died of AIDS alone or being helped by other lesbian women, predominantly in the city. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence did a great deal of, and it's a charitable. Google is your friend on this one. That's a deep dive. But there were lots and lots of people my age, predominantly gay men, that don't exist today. My role models don't exist because they're all dead. Because the AIDS epidemic was downplayed, ignored on an administrative level by President Reagan, who I actually kind of idolized for a while, and now I kind of vilify him.
Yeah.
So let's talk about religious trauma. In those years, I'm taught to lie about my core identity. I'm taught to fear chasing my core identity. And I have this blueprint and this cultural religious expectation that I do these things. So I do those things. And the gaslighting is strong. And I try to convince myself, well, maybe the church actually is real. Maybe there is some shred of truth in this that can all make sense. Let's do the thing. Let's get married. I told my ex-wife that I was trans before we got married. Neither one of us really knew what that meant. We walked on eggshells the entire 20 years we were married. And at the end of our marriage, it was full of a lot of lying from me to her about who I was and what I was doing. I actually started teaching and had transitioned, teaching as Kimberly at the university in the university system. She didn't know. I never told her. So now I'd kind of socially transitioned, professionally transitioned, and I'm changing my clothes and wiping off my face every day coming home so that when I get home, I'm not Kimberly, I'm somebody else that they know and accept. So this is basically my entire life of being encouraged to not pursue my authentic identity.
I
Not to
was going to
mention,
ask if there was a point or any, because this is my own understanding, and so correct me if I'm being ignorant or wrong, but in strict faiths like the Mormon Church, you're not allowed / supposed to socialize with people outside the faith to be able to have those interactions and those connections to say, hey, this is who I feel I am. Like,
right?
I was going to ask, within the church, was there ever like anyone that you could, hey, I feel this way. What about you? And then I heard you say, I told my wife before we got married I was trans. And I was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. So
Right.
were there any other people that you felt you could kind of open up to through that time or no?
No, no,
Yeah.
no, not at all. In fact, this is an important part of my experience and kind of part of the work I do today in trauma. In Mormonism, you're taught to go to your bishop, your local community leader, to confess your sins. Had I told my bishop I was trans, had I told my bishop I wasn't quite sure if I liked boys or liked girls, because that is really confusing when you're trying to figure out a trans identity primarily. Well, if I'm trans and I'm a boy and I like girls, and that means I'm straight. But if I really internally feel like a woman and I like women, then I'm technically gay. But if I never transition, then I'm straight. But if I do transition, then I'm gay. And all that messiness. So I learned very early on that these people at the church had no idea what to do with me. And so my only saving grace was that I kept my mouth shut. Now, had I shared with my bishop my feelings about my gender identity or my sexual orientation, I would have probably been sent to a therapist, a church therapist, and I probably would have had some sort of conversion therapy. Many people have died by suicide because of conversion therapy, primarily for sexual attraction, but also for gender identity. Because I kept my mouth shut and didn't tell anybody, nobody knew that I needed to be fixed. So I stayed out of the conversion therapy pipeline, the formal conversion therapy pipeline. The
So
work
you
I
were
do
literally
now,
just in survival mode this whole
oh,
time.
I was
Talk about
total
trauma.
survival mode.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I was in freeze the whole time because I couldn't fight and I couldn't run. I was not a big people pleaser, but I tried to do my best as far as the fawning is concerned. But I was really in freeze mode. The work that I'm doing now, I'm part of a founding organizer of a group called Conversion Therapy Survivors, and I hold a trauma processing group once a month, sometimes twice a month, with people from all over the world that come in and we process their trauma regarding conversion therapy or CT. Most of these people had a very formal, I'm seeing a therapist or I'm seeing an ecclesiastical leader for conversion therapy. There's kind of a secondary conversion therapy that I would consider myself subject to, and that would be informal conversion therapy, where I'm just taught repeatedly over and over that who I am and what I experience is abhorrent and unacceptable and of the devil. So I'm trying to do conversion therapy on myself every day of my entire life. Which one is worse? Which one is better? We don't scale and compare trauma. There's no winner in the oppression Olympics, that's for sure. But I know that because of who I am and what I've been through, and specifically now that I'm a therapist, I can work with conversion therapy survivors, and we can do some really good, strong work. In fact, I'm going to be in New York running a workshop later on this fall, I think in October, up in Lake Placid with a bunch of conversion therapy survivors. So that informs my personal trauma, informs the work I'm able to do now with conversion therapy survivors and within the population that I'm focusing on here in Utah, transgender youth, adolescents, and their families.
I love that you brought up that point of my own experiences inform my practice. I'm sure you get it all the time too on social media. Hey, Amanda, I want to be a therapist, but I have this condition and this condition and this condition.
Yay!
Right? Like I have
Yeah, you
bipolar, or
already
I have
qualified.
BPD, or I have trauma. And I'm like, come on.
That's right.
That's, my caveat is go to therapy, do your own work. Good therapists go to therapy. And yes, come on, right? Like your experiences do inform your practice. And I just had to do that little aside because I get that question so much. And I'm like, all right, we're on the podcast. So let's just like throw it out there. Yes, your trauma, your diagnoses, your experiences are what we need to fuel this profession in a healthy way when you've managed your own stuff. So I appreciate you saying that.
Can I tell a quick anonymous story?
Absolutely.
Last week, I have a client. So I have a trans client. Well, 85 to 95% of my caseload is trans people. Particularly one trans person has DID, dissociative identity disorder. And we were talking about future plans and what might be in the way and what may be not in the way. And I said, you're going to make a really good therapist one day. And I say this a lot, often to my clients, because many of my clients have a lot of trauma and have a unique thing that they're going through that would make them wonderful therapists. So I say it a lot. And every time I do, I mean it. So I say it to this client, and they just paused. They stop. They break down. They start crying. And I said, what are you feeling right now? What are you experiencing in your body right now? And they said, I've never considered that there's a path forward for me. And I've never had anybody else consider what I'm going through an asset and a strength. I've never had anybody see in me something that's worthy of a higher noble path.
Yeah.
I've felt like I'm stuck and this is how my life's going to be, just struggling and getting through for the rest of my life. And I said, well, these things that you're going through right now, they are going to make you infinitely qualified to reach a very specific niche of people. And so I'm with you. If you have trauma, if you have interesting life circumstances, if you're part of any marginalized community, if you have any diagnoses at all that you consider, broken or anything like that, take care of your own stuff. You don't need to be perfect. Let's be very clear about this. Therapists are not perfect, and we continue to scrub and work on our own stuff every single day. But if you have a
We need
predilection,
you.
we have to.
We
It's
need you
required.
in this
Yeah.
profession. Yeah. And I love that you said broken, because that's the word that was coming to mind is when you were talking about your client, is that they often feel so broken by these conditions that they couldn't possibly
Right.
do anything with it. And the other thing that came to mind is, I don't know if you've heard the term, but like anxiety is your superpower, or, like whatever your condition is, it's your superpower. And then if you
Right.
think about like cancer survivors, or I worked a lot in addiction, so people that are in recovery now and they lift the next person up in AA, or they become peer supporters themselves, your experiences inform that. So
Right.
I love that we went off on that
Well, I was talking
sidebar.
to a
So
friend of mine
necessary.
last night on Marco Polo, and they are
Yeah.
going to school in San Francisco or in Oakland, and they were talking with someone in their cohort looking for a therapist. The building is right by the fire station. So this particular person in my friend's cohort is queer and deaf. So that's a tall ask to look for a trauma-informed, queer, deaf therapist. So if you are that person that is a niche within a niche within a niche, please become a therapist. I promise you, you will never be underemployed. You will never be unemployed, and you will never feel more useful and more qualified and more needed than if you decide to do this path, become qualified and trained and serve that population that you yourself are uniquely qualified to serve within.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. So, I mean, just the layers of oppression and
Right?
stigmatization, right? Um, okay. So let's get back to you. So you started to like kind of play the role. Your safest place, the place that should have been the safe space, right? Your comfort space, home, was now the most unhelpful, uncomfortable place, and you were able to be yourself more out in the world.
Right.
How long did you play that role for before and what was like because you said your shelf-breaking moment was when you got your blessing. So what was the moment where you decided, I'm leaving the church?
Probably that day that my shelf broke when I was 16. But I couldn't because I'm trapped in this system now.
Yeah.
I'm beholden to this system. And when my wife and I decided to get married, now I've made a commitment for, roughly 18 years until our children are old enough to leave the nest and I can now kind of reclaim my own life.
Yeah.
I was actually making some plans to transition when my wife and I decided to get married for some various reasons. And there was a point in our marriage where she wanted a third child, and I said no. I said no because I wasn't ready to devote another extra chunk on the end of these first two kids to get to the point where I could start my own life. So my marriage lasted 20 years. I was married when I was 26, and we got divorced when I was about 46. So a 20-year marriage and 20 years of trying to make it work, trying to figure out the right path, trying to be what we call a nuanced or a progressive Mormon, trying to hide my internal self from the world and feeding her, giving her energy so that, quite frankly, I can stay alive. There were many points in my journey where I had plans, means, and intent mixed with a lot of fear. The fear is what kept me alive. I don't want to dive into that because I know that can be very emotionally activating for a lot of people. But let's just say I wear a semicolon tattoo on my body for a very important reason. And that's to remind myself that I have chosen to continue my journey. And I work my client base incredibly chronically suicidal. Many therapists don't allow their clients to text them or contact them between sessions. My clients that are suicidal, I tell them, please, 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 please reach out. Please reach out. And they do. And in their safety planning, we have other people that are also, we've signed ROIs and they're in their circle of friends and their trusted circle. Those friends reach out. The moms reach out. Hey, what do you think? So-and-so is feeling pretty suicidal today. And I'm like, okay, I'll check in. Do a check-in. Sometimes that kid is taken to a friend's house. Sometimes that kid is checked into uni, either by themselves or by a loved one or by a partner. Sometimes all it takes is a check-in. Sometimes I have the mental health unit respond and check in with them. I try not to become personally involved because I want to make sure that they can rely on their supports. But I also like that they check in with me because I can be that support when they're feeling really, really acute.
Yeah. Do you
So
work with you work with a lot of kids? Do you work with adults?
I work with some adults. It's primarily youth and young adults. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone that you work with that has also left the church?
Nearly all of them. And if they're
Oh,
not, if they haven't left the church, then they are in the process of their shelf breaking.
okay.
And I literally watch my clients' hearts break week after week after week. It's like watching a slow motion train wreck that as an ethical therapist, I cannot tell them what to do. They know my path. My path is very public. I've done podcasts, I've done YouTube interviews, I've written op-eds for the newspaper about the church. My stance on Mormonism, as in this podcast, is very apparent that if you did a search for me, you would learn very quickly that I think the church is not an honest, authentic path to God. And the church is an incredibly narcissistic, toxic community that inflicts trauma on nearly everyone except cis, white, straight men. And even they experience trauma. So if you want to know how Kimberly feels about the church, do a little Google search. You'll find out really fast. So they know my path. And when we first meet, I disclose. I say, look, I know you're actively LDS. It's going to be important for you to know that I'm not, that this is my path. And as you're a therapist, I promise you that my path will not influence your path. I will try to make sure it doesn't as best I can.
Yeah.
And several points during treatment, we'll check in. I'll say, I can kind of see these key moments, having been through this, having worked with many hundreds of people that have left the church by now. I can kind of see these pivotal moments in their life. And when I feel that there is an inkling of me influencing their story, I say, now let's remember, your path is your path. And I'm doing the best I can right now not to jump in. Instead, I'm doing the best I can to stay out and let you experience your own journey. I was told very early that one of the ways to dissolve or disarm countertransference is to name it in the moment. And so that's what I do.
Absolutely. I think I love that point because I don't know about your training or, where you went to school or different parts of the country. But I'm actually working on developing a training for providers on ethical self-disclosure, because in my training, at least, and my colleagues, it's like, just don't do it. Don't do it ever.
I disagree 100%.
Right? And like, some people go to the extent of they won't wear their wedding ring. They won't even have pictures of their cats or dogs in their office. They drive a different car to work or park way far away. Just like all sorts of dramatic things to completely strip their identity from people. And that could be harmful in itself, because it's like, are you a robot? Like, how can you possibly help me if you're not even remotely relatable, right? So I love that you brought that point up too.
I want my clients to know who I am.
Yeah.
I expect them to know who I am. If they're coming to me and they don't know these things about me, they're seeing the wrong therapist. I became a therapist to work with transgender people. I became a therapist to help people who are struggling with this reconciliation, whether it's possible or not, between their spiritual identity, their gender identity, and their external life performance. That's why I became a therapist. So if you're seeing me for depression and anxiety and a couple of other things that really, I mean, clearly they play into being queer and being trans, but if that's the only thing that you're seeing me for, you're not my client.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm screening
I think
now.
it strips away the opportunity
Yes.
of for informed consent. I think,
Right. Yeah, how would you feel? I mean, I can't hide that I'm trans. I certainly can't hide that I'm a former Mormon. So, but let's say for some miraculous reason you were able to not see my transness and not understand who I was as a former Mormon. Imagine being 2, 3, 4 months into treatment, then all of a sudden realizing, how duped would you feel?
right.
Would that relationship of trust between me and you, would that be enhanced, or would it be shattered? Probably be shattered. And then I'm even a worse therapist for you because now I've inflicted even more trauma. So I have to disclose. I was taught this phrase. I'm sorry, I'm getting really passionate about this. I was taught this phrase, therapeutic use of self. So I always think about when I disclose, does it start with a therapeutic aspect in mind? Is there a reason therapeutically to share this thing with you about me? And if there's not, I try not to share it as best as I can.
Yep.
And if there's a question about it, I'll say, is it okay if I share something that I've been through or something that we have in common that I think might be relevant? And they nearly every single time, please share this with me.
Yeah, I think a
They
lot of times
like
it's
to
a
hear it.
rapport builder, and also it helps you get past stuck points. Like, I'm stuck here and I can't potentially relate. A lot of times in trauma too, it's like that moment where they're second guessing, arguing with themselves, that possibly can't be traumatic. It's fine, right? And then I'm like, hold on a second.
It's fine. We're fine. It's all okay. Ching, trauma, 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 trauma. Wasn't that bad? Trauma. Yeah.
So what can we do, if anything, on an individual and system global, level, to address some of these concerns that we talked about with identity development and religious trauma?
Oh, now we're stepping smack into my plan to conquer the world. If I'm a superhero, and I use this example all the time, if I'm a superhero in a movie of my life, by the way, Charlize Theron is going to play Kimberly Anderson. It's already figured, it's already decided. Yeah.
Perfect.
So on one side of the battlefield is me in this really hot white latex outfit. On the other side of the field of battle are my two arch enemies, shame and guilt. And their nefarious sidekick, fear. Because shame and guilt together often result in fear. My goal as a therapist, my goal as a human being, is to be safe, to exude love. I've replaced Mormonism with love. I wear a heart around my neck every day as a symbol of that, as a reminder of that. If I can channel my inner Fred Rogers every single day, that is my goal. And when in the course of working with an individual, I start hearing shaming language and guilting language come up, we kind of pause and I say, I want to share with you my framework about shame and guilt. And I share with them my take on it, not from a symptomatic level of shame and guilt. Here's what happens when you experience it, but rather I work back and I go to causality of shame and guilt. And I needle into it and I say, this is the source of shame, this is the source of guilt, and here's how we can battle that. And we go back to identity formation and development when we talk about internalized shame that we learn from our parents at a young age, who we need love and affection from so desperately that we will accept their messages of what you should have, need to be. When we approve of, when we integrate those messages from an outside source at a young enough age, that becomes internalized shame. So if I'm working with a client that can't raise or lower the bar of expectation for themselves, then we say, well, where did that message, where did that expectation come from? Well, I don't know. It's always been there. Where do we learn messages that have always been there? You learn them from a young age, usually from a parent or caregiving figure.
That's my favorite question to ask when I hear someone say should. And I'm like, should? If you're saying should, that's probably not your voice. Whose voice is that?
That's right.
Is that, and like you said, parent, caregiver, religion,
God.
faith. Because I don't work with I think I've had a couple former LDS clients, but I'm in Ohio, in my part of the world, very strong Catholic religious trauma. So I often see that too. And then societal with media, social media, and the internet. So I find those three common: either it's parent, caregiver, the society at large, or religious is someone else's message. And I love that question. I ask it all the time. Whose voice is that? I'm not sure. Where did that come from?
Yeah. So then we get to unwind where those messages came from, at what age, where did they come from? In the work that I do, I kind of have a three-prong attack on giving people skills to empower themselves. And I teach them about codependency, I teach them about narcissistic abuse, and I teach them about boundaries. And I believe that if I can empower a client with really clear information about codependency and how it is formed, when I can empower them with a conversation and information regarding narcissistic abuse and patterns that narcissists use, and really kind of even DSM criteria, what is narcissism? And then I can teach them about boundaries, how to identify a boundary, where it's needed, how we would form that boundary, and how to maintain that boundary. Once we kind of have this understanding of an individual sense of core self-worth, then they're empowered to kind of examine every system that they're part of and say, wait a minute, is this a codependent relationship? Is this a narcissistic?
Does that align with who I am?
Right. Who am I? And often with these religious shelf-breaking moments, like you were saying, they instigate, they are the catalyst for an existential crisis. I know people who became actively suicidal because of their shelf breaking. It's not uncommon. Everything's in question. Everything's up in the air. Everything they built their life around was a lie. The key word in much of this work is betrayal. And then below betrayal, we get to grief. I had a professor at University of San Francisco, that's where I went to school. She told me that all of this work ultimately is grief work. And I said, no, that's not true. And she's like, all right, you think you're so smart. And I'm like, yeah, I am smart, dang it. Tell me what work's not grief work. Well, what about this work? And she's like, well, dissect that. I'm like, okay. What about this work? Okay, well, let's dissect. Oh, yeah, dang it, you're right. What about this? What about this? What about this? What about that? So I'm really learning and reframing all the stuff I do as trauma and grief.
I would have never thought I would focus so much on grief in my practice, right? Because that's a whole nother subject we could do a whole podcast about. But
Jesus,
generally, society thinks grief, they think death. And it's so much more than that. It's a
It's
shattering
everything.
of what you thought was. It's a shattering of your reality, right? It's, I am very open about my chronic pain. So, I'm pretty young. I'm in my early 30s and I got that diagnosis mid 20s. So my chronic pain and my conditions and my ability, the things that I can't do anymore, that was a grief for me. And it still is
Right.
something I work through every day. It was life shattering. Okay, wait, can I do this? I can't get out of bed anymore. Oh wait, how am I going to have the career I wanted? Now I have to have my partner help me with all these things, lifting laundry baskets, and oh, I can't get out of bed to take care of the animals. And I mean, just so many things that you thought your life was going to be. And now it's completely different. And the last podcast, we talked about that because Morgan, with her TBI, in her accident, she was 21 when that happened.
Huge
She was
grief.
like young and partying and just wanted to live her life. And that was a grief shattering moment. So I love that you brought that up because grief is so much more than just death. It's the loss of what you thought was or what is or what could be.
What you had that you felt you deserved that would never disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now when I'm doing work, as we're having these therapeutic conversations, my ears are always looking for where's the grief? Where we're talking about this, but under this is grief. To
And
resolve
identity
this,
fits
yeah,
in that grief.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Identity is key to that grief. How we experience grief often is relative to who we are. My daughter's getting married later this year. I'm grieving the fact that I won't be her father at her wedding. I'm grieving that. Imagine how she feels. Huge grief, tremendous
Yeah. And
grief.
even just in the pandemic too, right? And I think a lot of people don't realize how much grief there was in the pandemic of a
Oh,
loss
so here's
we
the part
had.
about the marginalized communities becoming therapists and how desperately you're needed. If you enrolled today, you'd be a therapist in roughly 2.5 to 3 years as an associate working under someone's license, which that's what I am.
Yeah.
And you would be doing the work that you are perfectly attuned for with your population. And in the next 2 to 3 years, let's face it, we're going to have a global understanding, a global awakening about trauma and grief. So, to anybody out there watching or listening to this, get your butt out of bed if you can, or if you can't, get a laptop and scooch it up next to you and find a local program that you can enroll in and become a therapist. It's going to be
Absolutely.
hard. It's
Or
going
a
to be really
recovery
hard.
or a peer supporter,
Anything,
recovery,
yeah. KDAC,
something in the mental
anything,
health
yeah.
profession. Yeah.
Yep.
Start a support group.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I could go
Yeah, if you
on and
can.
on.
Oh, of course we
Kimberly, I
could.
could talk to you for hours, but I always try to be mindful of time because, when I listen to podcasts, like when it starts to get to an hour, I'm like, okay, I got to get to my next thing. I might add an hour of lunch to listen to this, but I got to move on.
Too
I
bad.
always ask people, what is one thing we've talked about so many things. What is one thing you would leave our audience with? Is there a mantra?
Yes.
Is there a last little
Yes.
bit? Yeah.
Don't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm.
Mm.
That is not my saying. Let's be very clear about this. I stole this from someone who stole it from someone who stole it from someone. And it's what I say to nearly all my clients, nearly every time we meet.
Yeah.
And if someone out there in Internetville can figure out the source for that quote, I would happily attribute them. I have been able to locate it. So apparently now people just think it's my quote, but it's not. It's a lot of people's quote. That
Yeah.
is my go-to. Don't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm because you're sacrificing your identity. And that's the nugget of codependence that will crush you.
And your own safety and survival.
All of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you for that reminder. I've heard that too. So thank you for that reminder because it's always a good one. Okay. And then where can people find you if they want to follow your story, they want to learn more about you?
If they want to hear, like, I've done a 4-hour interview, a 4-part interview about my life story on a podcast called Mormon Stories. That's on either YouTube or on mormonstories.org or on openstoriesfoundation.org. Just go search for Kimberly Anderson, Mormon Stories. You'll find it. It will pop up. You can find me on TikTok. You can find me. I'm very, very, very rarely posting anything on Facebook anymore. My Instagram feed is foot selfies since 2015, 2014, 2013, maybe even. So you'll find pictures of my feet on my Instagram page. So if you want to go there. Most of the stuff I'm doing right now is on TikTok because it's such a fun platform, and the community is so robust and so friendly and so loving and caring. And that's how we met.
Yes.
But if you want to find, I have writing on medium.com. I have my own podcast called Therapist on Therapist, which I would love to interview you on. So many things. And just Google me. I mean, Kimberly Anderson is a pretty generic name, but if you typed in Kimberly Anderson, transgender, Mormon therapist, you would find stuff.
Perfect. I love how easily Googleable you are.
It's with a very generic name.
And I will probably link your TikTok. Like, I'll just put the link for people to kind of follow you there, and then the rest of the things they can kind of Google. But you put a lot of good content on TikTok.
I try to.
Thank you. I would love to be on your show. Obviously, we can talk more about that later. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing your own story, being an empowering advocate for others that have been through similar experiences. It's so necessary.
Thank you. This was really fun. Is it really an hour? Are we done? Because I could
maybe we'll have to have you back for a part 2.
Only if it's necessary.
I think anything could be necessary.
I like that.
All right. Well, thank you, audience, for listening. As always, make sure you like and subscribe so you know when the next episode is coming out. If you have any comments, please comment for Kimberly, and we will get, if there's any questions, we can get them to Kimberly to answer, or maybe we can get some contact information if people wanted to follow, kind of connect with you further. And then next week, here you go, Kimberly. This was something that we ended up turning into a series because there was too much to talk about. My good friend Lisa Schaefer, we started talking about chakras and trauma healing. And so we are starting our series on that next week, starting with the root chakra.
I heard the first part of that, and I loved that episode. It was amazing.
Yeah.
I want to go howl in the woods with you guys and do chakra alignment and all that.
Yes. Yeah. That was like, we're getting in a van. That was a different episode, but yeah, we've talked about chakras a couple different times, but yeah, that was like, we're going to take a van and go out in the woods.
I have gas money, and we can do that because I want in on that.
Awesome. And you already have do you have an RV or you have a?
It's Airstream.
Airstream. Yeah. I couldn't think of the name of it. Yeah, so super excited. But Lisa's going to start going through each chakra starting next week, starting with the root chakra and how that impacts our trauma healing. So super excited about that. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.